Hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forum. I am your host, Daren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. If you're asking the question, what is the show about? We bring you a forum discussing and providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that many communities face, from systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives and insights, helping us better understand and address the challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us. The Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. Across the country, our urban communities face several challenges. One of those being inequity in leadership and opportunity gaps in our education system that impact marginalized families and students, leading to disproportionate academic outcomes within schools, reduced socioeconomic and social mobility, and an increase in juvenile recidivism rates. These are not isolated incidents, but actually symptoms of a larger issue. One that bears the question, can equitable school leadership exist across our school districts in a political climate that challenges DEI initiatives? Today, we examine that very question through the work of two leading education researchers, co-authors of the book, Doing the Work of Equity, Leadership for Justice and Systems Changes. We welcome Professor of Educational Foundations Leadership and Policy at the University of Washington, Dr. Ishimaru, and then also Dr. Decoteau J. Irby, professor at the University of Illinois of Chicago. And we thank you so much for joining us and taking the time of sharing with us today. And welcome to the Social Justice Forum.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll take the time and just ask the question, the background behind your book. What really drove you to say, listen, we really want to tackle this issue of equity and bring it home?
Well, you know, this work isn't new, right? We've been up to addressing educational injustices for a very long time. But in around 2016 or so, Dr. Irby and Dr. Terrence Green and myself started talking to each other and realizing there were some new roles emerging. And that was the role of the equity director, and districts across the country were initiating these roles and starting to do a lot of work around addressing these longstanding inequities. And that was kind of the beginning of our long-term research. It's been almost 10 years now. We expanded from the role of that individual to understanding kind of over time how leadership changes educational systems in 3 districts, and really trying to understand how that gets shared and spread amongst multiple educators across time.
Yeah. Dr. Decoteau, for you, obviously a labor of love, 10 years, I understand, in the making. For yourself, you know, looking at the issue of equity, what was the driving factor for you saying, listen, I need to write this and we need to talk about this?
Yeah, well, first it was, our curiosity about how we can make schools work for children who they historically haven't, and oftentimes contemporarily right now don't work well for. Personally, I'm a father. I'm also a researcher. I've had a research agenda focused on educational equity for years. And when these new roles, this increased emphasis around equity leadership, celebration and recognition of Black Lives Matter, adopting Juneteenth, celebrating different affinity groups, once these things started to proliferate around the country, we're really curious about, do they actually matter for students' experiences, and do they actually change outcomes? What matters and what changes when districts adopt an outward intentional focus on making schools more equitable?
And you take a good look at that in your writing, in your work, and I want to talk about where we are today because it's very, it's very timely. We talk about, DEI. We talk about that word that seems like a bad word across certain parts of Washington D.C. and really across certain parts of our nation. But how does this whole anti-DEI really affect where we are when it comes to really dealing with district level equity leaders?
It depends, right? So it depends on where people are in the country. It depends on the kind of leadership, the kind of boards that are in particular districts. And so we see a lot of variation, which is one of the main themes of the book. in places like in the South, their DEI work has been under attack for a longer period of time than more recently. But now, of course, like here in Chicago, there's a federal withholding of funds because the Chicago Public Schools has a Black Student Success Plan, for example. So there are some implications. A lot of it has to do with like withholding of federal funds right now. But we are also know that there's been work, as Ann mentioned at the top of the segment, that people have been doing this work for a long time. So people and districts can roll back, a particular initiative. They can roll back a particular policy, but what they can't roll back is the day-to-day work that people in schools, parents, students, and communities have been doing even before these roles were in place. And the good thing that we found out is that even in the midst of all of these attacks on equity leadership, DEI programs, and initiatives, people in communities are still doing the work of making sure their children have access to the opportunities that are going to improve their educational experiences.
Yeah. Dr. Ishimaru, I want to talk a little bit about, the shocking the system, if you will, because I think that's one of the ways that things occur. And when you talk about shocking the system for our viewers, please give an understanding of what that really means. And really, after you do that, talk to us about how this actual shock is really impacting and changing the lens of equity in some places.
Yeah. So I think one of the things we talk about early in the book, and we feature chapters also by practitioners and other scholars as well. And one of the chapters really addresses this idea of Black women and their leadership as a shock to the system. And so I think there's another chapter that we wrote about is really holding this kind of complexity that you've hired people whose expertise and lived experiences of racism, of other intersectional oppression is really vital to their ability to make change. And on the other hand, their job is to disrupt that system. So the all of the different ways that districts function on an everyday basis are implicated in that. And we feature in the book actually the beginning of each of the sections. We have a kind of morning time, a midday, and evening work that correspond to the shifts in the social political moment across time. But each of those leads off with the Black women leadership, and that is creating this kind of shock to the system. At the same time, though, that they are constantly being faced with resistance, undermining of their work, and these microaggressions that lead to a very profound kind of battle fatigue that can unfold across time. At the same time, though, these are the folks who are really at the forefront of this leadership.
We talk about power a lot, and when it comes to equity, the biggest, one of the biggest enemies to equity is power. And the power, the fact that it needs to be shifted. Sometimes power needs to be, redistributed. How do you address and how do you see the power dynamic when it comes to equity and really unpacking that in such a way that brings for the redistribution of power so that way equity can really take hold?
One of the most powerful ways that we saw consistently across all of the districts, all of the leaders that we, explored, talked to for our research project was this idea of engaging with children and families. So, for example, there was one chapter, our colleagues Andrew Maschiner and Ishmael Miller co-authored a chapter where they looked at what equity leaders wanted to do and what they actually did, on the day-to-day basis. And one of the ones that was a top three that was consistent across both of those was engage with children, students, and families. This was something that they said they did often and something that they also said that they wanted to do and felt was very important. And so that's, again, one of those things that has staying power, because while you can take away initiatives, shifting power to make sure families and students have an active voice, an active role in shaping what their educational experiences are, is something that can exist and persist and be sustained even in the midst of the kind of attacks that we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So if I'm an educator, if I'm a parent, and I'm looking out there and I'm saying, listen, you know what? I hear there's this equity agenda, but the reality is it doesn't measure up. How am I able to determine whether or not I've got, sound or substance?
I think a lot of it goes back to what Dakota just said, right, is really thinking about, one of the issues that a lot of these leaders took up were looking at data and creating new routines for looking at data and disaggregating data. But ultimately, we can think about talking to and listening to the young people, families, and communities who've been marginalized in our systems for decades, and to really understand what their experiences are in the system. And that ultimately is what helps us understand if we're moving the needle. We can also look at various forms of data, and we have to look beyond just the singular achievement assessments, but to also look at the quality of life in schools, and think about how young people are experiencing their everyday learning and opportunities.
The learning and the opportunities are what people really want to see in the educational system. We want our kids to be able to learn. We want them to be able to take advantage of opportunities, but understanding how the educational system is, that one word that we've been talking about throughout the course of this whole show, which is equity, really comes into play in order to make sure that everyone has a fair, equal opportunity to be able to advance that, if I'm a parent, what should I be paying attention to these days when it comes to, addressing equity as best as a parent can address it?
I think there's a number of different things. So we saw things like making sure students had access to more academically rigorous coursework. So that could be AP, that could be honors, that could be for middle schoolers having access to algebra early. We know algebra is important. It could also be access to teachers who share the kind of cultural experiences and racial affinities that students have. So this is about hiring. So we should see and want to see the teaching force become increasingly diverse over time, which is something that a lot of the leaders focused on. We could also think about what students have the opportunity to read and how expansive the knowledge base that they have access to is. So, for example, this week we just had what we call Indigenous Peoples Day, and which in some districts call Columbus Day. Well, having it be Indigenous Peoples Day is important for communities that have historically been marginalized. It's not that we say that it's not that we ignore Columbus, but that we actually tell the truth about the role that Columbus played in the genocide of indigenous people in the United States. So those are the kind of things that I would encourage parents to be thinking about, because those are the things that really develop a student's sense of self-determination and identity, that give them the kind of sense that they can make and create a more just world.
Yeah. Dr. Ishimaru, I want to get an opportunity to talk about some mistakes that people make sometimes when we are addressing this issue of equity. And when we do, what are some of the common mistakes that we can talk about when it comes to addressing this issue? Because it's very easy to get sidetracked or to put my focus somewhere else and then miss the whole thing, right? So what are some of the common mistakes that people make?
Yeah, I think one of the things Maurice Sweeney with Dakota wrote a chapter about some of his work in a large urban district, and one of the things that happens a lot is that the folks who are doing this work within systems can just be focused on putting out fires, and they're always going to be these fires, and that's one of the things that the leaders in these systems really realized that they needed to do, is to think about how to prioritize their work, how to build influence across the system. Another mistake is to think that somehow one person's going to save the day, right? So we have to all think about, whether we're educators or we're parents or we're leaders, or we work in community-based organizations or agencies, to think about the role that each of us is going to take in this collective change that needs to happen. So, it would be not just putting out fires, but really prioritizing the focus and the work given the context that we're in right now, and really making sure that we're not waiting for permission or a particular title. And then I think the third thing is a kind of misstep often is people, sometimes educators, sometimes feel like they need to just stay within the box of their formally defined role and what the system expects of them. And one of the things that we saw across all of the different chapters in the context was that leaders were really coloring outside the lines as they took up their work. It wasn't just about maintaining the system as it is, but really working with others to try to transform it.
Yeah. We talk about working with others. There's a lot of work that's going on, and people are doing the work. The work takes time. How do you deal with the issue of the work takes time, but then you've got the necessity of now, which becomes ever more prevalent given today's political, socio-economical climate. Somebody say, listen, we need the emphasis on now, but then those who are in the trenches say this work takes time.
Yeah, that was something else that was very clear over the time that we did the research. One of the things that we were able to appreciate because we studied this leadership practices over time was how people early on, what we ended up call like seeding work in these mornings, they were doing things like writing policies, creating policies, networking with school boards, framing issues, all these different sorts of things. And they were really, I would characterize, they were unhappy and unpleased with the work that they actually did when we would talk to them. They would say, a lot of what we're doing isn't working. It's not making an impact. But when we talk to those same people and when we see what their districts look like, 5, 6, 7 years later, the people who came behind them had the benefit of actually harvesting the seeds that they planted earlier. So now you had people stepping in who didn't have to think about a policy. They didn't have to frame the issue. They didn't have to get a board's approval for how they wanted to implement something. These people could come in and really hit the ground running. And we call that midday equity work. And so, I think that the important thing is that we want people to understand is that even when you're doing work in a particular moment, you may not get the actual results that you want in the time that you want them, but the work isn't in vain because that work lays a foundation and a groundwork for people to pick up later on. And, we revised the book. We were supposed to submit the book to the publisher in November, and then Donald Trump was elected to the presidency. And so we did some additional work. And one of the things we wanted to end with is helping people understand that even in this moment that we call night, there's still work to be done. And if we're being strategic and strategizing and doing work, we know that a new morning is going to come, a new awakening is going to come. And so people will be able to pick up the lessons and the insights from people who have done the work in years past. So and that's one of the main things we wanted to convey in the book.
Yeah, I mean, and let me stay right there. What you talked about. Night has come, right? Night has come, and you've got
Yes.
a Trump administration that is anti-DEI. You've got people saying, "Listen, when is this going to be over with?" But we still have to fight the good fight of faith in the process of time. How do I go about continuing to fight that good fight in the wake of what's going on right now politically?
Yeah, I think it really we think often in different multiple different levels, right? So there's like the individual level, me as a parent or as a teacher, and what my everyday interactions, right? And there's ways to continue to quote unquote do the work, just in those everyday interactions in the classroom, the conversations we're having, the conversations I have with my kids. Those kinds of contexts are going to continue to be really important. At the system level, as Dakota said, it's really going to vary. Some of that work is going to have to be under cover of dark. So if we think historically about the things that communities have had to experience and have to continue to move through, we've had dark times before in many of our communities, and so some of that work is going to have to go on under cover of night. I think Dakota just did a session talking about the Underground Railroad, right? And then there are other places where it's going to be time to actually step up and come together collectively to figure out who's already doing that work in visible ways. They may be kind of beacons for that, and for people to stand up together and to resist. It's not always going to be about the language of equity so much. It's about this broader issue. We talk about justice and think about equity as kind of the little cousin of justice, in a sense that there's a broader aim of helping young people and their families and communities to realize their potential and to create a more just society.
Yeah. I think for all of us, no, I can't say for all of us because Lord knows, otherwise we wouldn't be where we are today, right? But I think for those of us who are on the side of wanting to see equity, and justice, as you talk about. There's got to be some intentionality that's placed, particularly in our educational system, because that's it's one of the, the school to prison pipeline is one of the biggest things that we talk about. And when we start to see that equity within justice, with justice as an end, we can reduce some of that school to prison pipeline that's out there. When I think about the work that you guys do, I think about the fact that here's 10 years of really like being in the trenches and really taking a look at some things. And for yourselves, obviously, there had to be some things that really came to mind to say, wow, this really blows my mind. Was there a point in the research where you were looking at some things where you knew what you were getting into, but really just stood out and spoke to you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out to me was the courage, the tenacity, the fight that Black women and women of color have been up to in these spaces. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I was raised by Black women in a family where Black women kind of like are the leaders and the pillars of the family and households. But I just think that I was continually impressed, amazed, proud of, and looked to the courage and, as Ann mentioned, this kind of coloring out of the line. For example, these are people who inherited very limited resources and were able to work magic with very little and change and create. They started this as called an office of one, one person, and then we're able to build out, a team of people to do this work and teams that represented multiple schools. And so just the organizing skills and the leadership skills of the Black women in particular, but women of color who participated in our research project, I think was the most important thing that I kind of like took away.
Yeah. Dr. Ishimaru?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really similar to that, the kind of creativity and the strategies that we saw folks take up. And in particular, in the last group of chapters, we talk about evening work as that pushback began. And then now we're moving into this, this night. And really seeing how folks are moving, even when they don't have the district explicit resources or commitments, and building networks and networks of support and continuing change making. And I think that's, given that racial battle fatigue that I mentioned before, it's not only important to sustain the individuals in this work, but we saw them pushing each other in their own leadership and connecting with each other, both within a given district, but then also outside of districts. So Dana Muniz has written a chapter about the communities of care that equity leaders are developing with each other outside of districts. And those are the kinds of networks that are going to enable us to keep the work moving.
Yeah. For someone who wants to get a hand on the book and really be able to take a look and take a deep dive, talk to us about how they can get their hands on it.
Yeah, so you can get the book on any online retailer, or you could go to the press, Teachers College Press. And you could also find access to the book through our websites. My website is DecoteauIrby.com.
Mine is AnnIshimaru.com.
And for both of you, obviously, a labor of love. As we said, 10 years in the making, now across the finish line. What's next? I mean, the work is out there, you're spreading the word, but for both of you, what do you see as next for you?
Well, one of the things that I'm working on is something called Measures That Matter. And I think one of the things that, a lot of the folks in the book are talking about working with data and trying to really expand how we think about that. Just back to your question about how do we know our kids are getting the learning and opportunities that they need and want. And so I'm working with a collaborative of other folks and just got back from North Carolina learning from beautiful work of Village of Wisdom and the Black families there. And so that's a kind of extension of some of this work to think across young people and families and the role that they play in ongoing work.
Well, I've written a book. My first book, Stuck Improving, was about equity, racial equity at the school level, and this book is about equity at the district level. I feel like the next thing that I've been increasingly interested in is the kind of micro level interactions between adults who provide educational experiences, opportunities, and services to Black children in particular. I'm really interested in kind of what those micro interactions are and how we can make sure that regardless of what's happening around us, we have the tools and the resources to interact with kids in the way that dignify them and help them feel like they have a tremendous amount of potential so they can grow up to be self-determined people.
And so I want to commend you both on the work. I think it's tremendous, to have a conversation around equity, particularly at a time such as this. I was very interested in hearing, as you said, the new presidential election takes root, and then all of a sudden you say you have to reshape, some of that ending of the book almost to keep hope alive, right? That has to be that message of how do we really navigate, this. For those that are doing the work, can you share with me a little bit about, is there this support system, if you will? Because those who are like trying to fan those flyers, you can sometimes become weary of well-doing. How do you get to a place of like being supportive, community, and you talk about that community of care. Is there a community of care of those in the area of equity and justice?
There are. That's actually one of the things that we changed right near the end, though, is we were listing out some of those different networks, and one of the things that we decided was maybe we're not going to actually list those all out in the book, given the current moment. So it's really about reaching out through the various professional networks that exist, and sometimes they're not necessarily going to be advertising really explicitly with the language that used to be used, but there are a number of networks that exist out there. And then also locally, people can reach out to the community-based organizations and coalitions that are beginning to develop. So really looking at who's already doing that work. Often you can look at the Black women leaders who are at the forefront and reach out to other educators who have been doing this work long before any of our formal initiatives and policies got put into place.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time and sharing with us. Great conversation. Certainly, we want to make sure that people get their hands on the book, as you said, those multiple platforms, and hopefully somebody can become encouraged doing the work of equity, leadership for justice, and systems change. Thank you so much to Dr. Irby and also Dr. Ishimaru. Come to the end of our show today, and we hope that you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. If you want to rewatch the show, guess what? Recablecast right here on BronxNet.org. Join the conversation, present your point of view. Visit our social media, BronxNet TV, and join us next week. We'll elevate the discussion and bring further awareness across the globe. I'm your host, Daren Jaime, saying take care. God bless.